There's a particular kind of gesture that shows up after a long stretch of silence, small enough to be denied later if it doesn't land well, low stakes enough that walking it back requires no real admission of anything, and quiet enough that it rarely announces itself as significant, even to the avoidant making it. It isn't a declaration, it isn't an apology, it isn't a request to talk. It's something considerably smaller and considerably more revealing than any of those things. A single tentative test of whether a door that was closed still has any give in it at all. This test deserves to be understood on its own terms, separate from the more dramatic reconciliation attempts explored elsewhere, because it operates according to an entirely different logic, driven by a completely different psychological need. It isn't asking for the relationship back. It isn't even necessarily asking for forgiveness. It's asking something much smaller and much more self-protective, whether reaching out at all carries any risk of humiliation, rejection, or confirmation of exactly how thoroughly the door has actually closed. Anyone listening who has noticed a small, seemingly minor gesture arrive after a long stretch of silence from an avoidant they once loved, something too small to feel like a real attempt at reconciliation, but too specific to feel like nothing at all, deserves to understand exactly what that gesture represents, what it doesn't represent, and how to think clearly about what, if anything, deserves to be done in response to it. It's worth naming, before going further, why this particular topic deserves such careful, dedicated examination rather than being folded into a broader discussion of avoidant reconciliation attempts explored elsewhere. This specific pattern, small, deniable testing rather than dramatic, high-intensity reaching out, occupies a genuinely distinct position within the broader landscape of avoidant behavior following a relationship's ending. It doesn't carry the acute urgency of the more intense reconciliation attempts explored in other examinations of this topic, and it doesn't offer the same clear, sustained evidence of change or continued significance that genuine peace or complete narrative erasure eventually reveal. It occupies a genuinely ambiguous middle ground, deliberately small and deliberately unclear, which is exactly why it deserves its own careful, dedicated framework for understanding what it actually means and what it doesn't. To understand why these small tests happen the way they do, rather than through some more direct, more honest form of communication, it helps to examine what's actually changed for the avoidant by the time enough silence has passed for this kind of testing to even occur. Throughout most of the relationship's active history, an avoidant typically operates from a position of relative safety regarding rejection, protected by the underlying assumption, already explored in other examinations of this topic, that the other person's continued investment and effort would remain reliably available regardless of how much distance got created. This assumption meant that reaching out, engaging, or reconnecting during the relationship's active period carried relatively low risk, since the underlying welcome could largely be taken for granted. By the time genuine, sustained no contact has occurred, considerably enough for the avoidant's usual assumptions to have finally broken down, this safety no longer exists. Reaching out now carries genuine, unfamiliar risk, the very real possibility of being ignored, rejected, or met with an indifference that would confirm exactly the fear of insignificance already explored as central to avoidant psychology throughout other examinations of this topic. This is precisely where the small testing gesture originates, not as a genuine attempt at reconciliation, but as a low-risk method of gathering information about whether a more direct approach would even be worth the exposure it would require. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone standing outside a house they used to have a key to, uncertain whether that key still works, unwilling to simply try the door directly and risk the visible, undeniable confirmation of finding it locked. Instead, they knock softly, quietly enough that, if no one answers, they can tell themselves the knock simply wasn't heard, rather than confronting the possibility that it was heard and deliberately ignored. This soft knock isn't really about gaining entry. It's about testing whether entry remains possible at all, calibrated specifically to allow retreat without humiliation if the answer turns out to be no. This is close to what these small tentative tests actually represent. They aren't genuine attempts to walk back through the door. They're reconnaissance, information-gathering missions designed to assess risk before committing to anything more exposed or more difficult to walk back from if it goes poorly. Understanding this distinction matters enormously because it explains why these tests so often feel confusing and frustrating to receive, arriving without any clear statement of intent, without any acknowledgement of what happened before, without any of the clarity that a genuine, honest attempt at reconciliation would presumably require. It's worth naming specifically what these tests tend to look like in practice, because their deliberately low stakes, deniable quality is precisely what makes them recognizable once the underlying pattern is understood clearly. It helps to describe a few of these forms in additional detail, because recognizing them specifically, rather than only in the abstract, makes the overall pattern considerably easier to identify accurately while it's actually happening. One common form involves what might be called the practical pretext. Contact justified by some seemingly legitimate, unrelated practical need, retrieving a belonging left behind, clarifying some logistical detail related to shared responsibilities or mutual acquaintances, using an entirely legitimate reason as cover for what's actually underneath, a test of whether any response at all will be forthcoming. This form tends to be one of the more common, precisely because the practical justification offers considerable protection against the vulnerability of a purely emotional, unprompted reach. Another common form involves what might be called the anniversary echo, contact that arrives specifically around some date carrying shared significance, timed in a way that could be coincidental, but that, upon reflection, tends to align suspiciously well with dates that would only carry significance to someone still tracking them internally. This form deserves particular attention because its timing itself carries information, revealing that the relationship's specific history remains present enough in the avoidance awareness to shape when this kind of testing behavior actually occurs. A further form involves what might be called the indirect visibility test, an avoidant ensuring their own continued existence and activity remains visible within some shared space or shared circle, without any direct contact at all, banking on the possibility that this visibility alone might prompt some response or acknowledgement from the other side, without ever having to risk the vulnerability of initiating anything more direct themselves. This particular form is worth naming because it represents perhaps the lowest risk version of testing available, requiring no direct action at all beyond simply remaining visible and waiting to see whether that visibility alone produces any reaction. A final form worth naming involves what might be called the third-party channel, testing conducted indirectly through mutual friends or family members, questions asked, information sought, without any direct contact occurring between the two people actually involved. This form deserves attention because it can be considerably harder to recognize as a deliberate test, since it doesn't involve any direct behavior from the avoidant toward the person they're actually curious about, but it serves precisely the same underlying function, gathering information about whether reconnection remains possible, while maintaining maximum distance from any direct risk or direct exposure. These tests typically also include some form of contact minimal enough to require no real explanation or acknowledgement if it goes unanswered, a brief, low-effort message referencing something entirely unrelated to the relationship's ending, an appearance, seemingly incidental, within some shared social or physical space where encountering each other becomes possible without either person having to initiate anything directly. They might involve some small, indirect acknowledgement of the other person's ongoing life, a reaction or response to something the other person shared publicly, offered without any accompanying direct message or explanation. What unites all of these specific forms is their shared, deliberate deniability. Each one can be explained away, if necessary, as coincidental, casual, or entirely unrelated to any genuine desire for reconnection, precisely because that deniability is the entire point. A test that couldn't be denied or walked back would carry exactly the kind of exposure and risk the avoidant is specifically trying to avoid by testing in the first place, rather than simply reaching out directly and clearly. This deliberate deniability deserves particular attention because it explains something that often causes considerable confusion and frustration for the person receiving these tests, the sense that they're being asked to do the interpretive work of figuring out what's actually being communicated without ever receiving anything clear or direct enough to respond to definitively. This confusion is not a failure of perception. It reflects an accurate reading of something genuinely ambiguous by design, a test deliberately engineered to remain vague enough that its sender can maintain plausible deniability regarding what it was actually meant to accomplish. There's something important worth naming here regarding what these tests do and don't actually reveal about an avoidant's underlying readiness for genuine reconciliation, because this distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to determine how to respond to one of these tests appropriately. A test reveals, reliably, that the avoidant is curious about whether the door remains open at all. It does not reveal, reliably, that the avoidant has done any of the internal work required to walk through that door differently than they did before, or that they are prepared to offer the kind of consistency and vulnerability that any renewed relationship would actually require in order to be healthy and sustainable this time around. This distinction between curiosity about possibility and genuine readiness for substantive change deserves to be held clearly throughout everything that follows, because conflating the two tends to produce exactly the kind of premature, hopeful re-engagement that so often leads to disappointment. Testing the door is, fundamentally, a low-commitment, low-risk action. It requires nothing beyond simple curiosity and a willingness to send something small and deniable. It does not require, and therefore does not reliably indicate, any of the considerably more demanding internal work that would actually need to have occurred in order for a renewed relationship to unfold any differently than the one that originally ended. It's worth exploring what typically happens next, depending on how this initial test gets received, because the subsequent behavior tends to reveal considerably more useful information than the initial test itself ever could on its own. If the test goes entirely unacknowledged, met with the same continued silence that preceded it, one of two things tends to happen. Some avoidants, having received this information, quietly retreat and never test again, having concluded, correctly or not, that the door has remained genuinely closed. Others, particularly those whose curiosity or unresolved feeling runs deeper, eventually attempt a second test, sometimes considerably later, sometimes taking a slightly different, marginally less deniable form than the first. If the test receives any response at all, even a minimal, neutral one, this tends to produce a noticeably different trajectory, often a gradual escalation in the directness and frequency of subsequent contact, testing the boundaries of what continues to be tolerated, incrementally increasing the stakes and the explicitness of what's actually being asked for. This escalation pattern deserves particular attention, because it explains why even a small, seemingly harmless response to an initial test can sometimes produce a considerably larger, more sustained pattern of renewed contact than the person offering that small response ever actually intended to invite. There's something worth naming regarding the specific timing this kind of testing tends to follow, because recognizing typical timing patterns helps clarify whether a particular gesture fits the framework being described throughout this exploration, or whether it's simply an unrelated, incidental piece of contact that happens to arrive around a similar period. These tests tend to cluster around specific kinds of moments, rather than occurring randomly throughout the silence. Moments carrying some heightened emotional significance for the avoidant specifically, even when that significance isn't obvious or visible from the outside. This often includes periods surrounding significant shared dates from the relationship's history, moments when an avoidant's usual routine happens to intersect with reminders of the relationship in ways that increase the felt pull toward testing whether reconnection remains possible. It also frequently includes periods following some other significant change or disruption in the avoidant's own life, a new relationship ending, a significant life transition, or some other circumstance that happens to increase their general sense of vulnerability and their general need for reassurance regarding their own continued significance to people who once mattered to them. This timing pattern matters because it reveals something important about what actually motivates these tests in the majority of cases, considerably more about the avoidant's own internal state and internal needs in that specific moment than about any genuine, sustained reflection on the previous relationship specifically. A test arriving during one of these particular kinds of moments deserves to be understood, at least in part as a byproduct of whatever else is currently happening in the avoidant's broader life, rather than purely as evidence of dedicated, ongoing reflection on the specific relationship that ended. This context doesn't necessarily diminish the test's significance entirely, but it does offer useful additional information for calibrating exactly how much weight that test actually deserves. There's something crucial worth naming here for anyone currently deciding how to respond, or whether to respond at all, to one of these tests. The decision doesn't need to be made in isolation from everything else already understood about avoidant psychology throughout other examinations of this topic. A test, on its own, reveals curiosity and unresolved feeling, both of which can be entirely real without indicating anything reliable about actual readiness for healthy, sustained reconciliation. Responding to a test isn't inherently unwise, but responding with the expectation that a positive reply will necessarily lead toward a substantively different, healthier version of the relationship risks building hope on a foundation that the test itself simply doesn't provide. It's worth addressing directly what a thoughtful, protective response to this kind of test might actually look like, because navigating this situation doesn't require choosing between complete immediate re-engagement and complete permanent silence as the only two available options. A measured response might acknowledge the contact without offering the kind of immediate warmth or enthusiasm that would signal a full, unconditional reopening of the relationship. It might involve responding honestly and directly, rather than with the same deniable vagueness the test itself was offered in. Naming clearly what would actually be required for any renewed conversation to feel worthwhile, rather than simply matching the ambiguity being offered. This kind of direct, honest response serves an important function beyond simply managing the immediate interaction. It removes the deniability the avoidant has been relying on throughout this entire process, forcing a choice between genuine, direct engagement or genuine, direct retreat, rather than allowing the relationship to drift back into the same kind of ambiguous, low-commitment territory that likely characterized much of its earlier difficulty. This isn't about punishing the avoidant for testing the door. It's about ensuring that whatever happens next occurs through clear, honest communication rather than through the same pattern of vague, deniable gestures that made the original relationship so difficult to navigate in the first place. There's something worth naming about the specific kind of vulnerability being asked of the person receiving this test, because it deserves acknowledgement rather than being glossed over in favor of simply analyzing the avoidance behavior. Receiving one of these tests after a period of genuine, hard-won distance can reactivate hope that took considerable effort to set aside, and responding to that reactivated hope with clarity and boundaries, rather than either enthusiasm or complete avoidance, requires real emotional discipline. This discipline deserves to be named as an accomplishment in its own right, not simply as a strategic response to someone else's ambiguous behavior. It's important here to address something that deserves direct, honest treatment, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misread as encouraging suspicion toward every small gesture that arrives after a period of silence, treating each one automatically as a calculated test rather than genuine, if awkward, human reconnection. This would be an oversimplification of what's actually being described here. Not every small gesture following silence reflects the specific, deliberately deniable testing pattern this exploration has been examining throughout. Sometimes small, low-stakes contact genuinely is just that, small and low stakes, without any larger, more calculated pattern underneath it. What distinguishes genuine testing from simple, incidental contact tends to involve the surrounding context and history, whether this small gesture arrives specifically after a significant, sustained period of complete silence, whether it carries a noticeable, deliberate quality of deniability, rather than simply being an ordinary, unremarkable interaction that would have happened regardless of the relationship's history, and whether it fits into a broader pattern already familiar from earlier explorations of how this specific avoidant has historically approached vulnerability and risk. Applying this framework indiscriminately to every small interaction following any relationship's ending risks producing exactly the kind of exhausting, anxious overinterpretation that serves no one well, and genuine self-honesty about whether a specific situation actually fits this pattern matters considerably more than reflexively assuming it always does. There's something worth exploring further, because it addresses a specific practical question that naturally follows from everything discussed so far: what this kind of testing actually predicts, if anything, about whether a full, genuine, healthy reconciliation eventually becomes possible. The honest answer, consistent with everything already explored throughout other examinations of avoidant psychology, resists a simple, satisfying prediction in either direction. Testing the door represents a necessary, though clearly insufficient, precondition for eventual reconciliation, since genuine reconciliation obviously can't occur without at least this much initial curiosity and initial willingness to risk some form of renewed contact. But its presence alone doesn't reliably predict whether that initial curiosity will ever develop into the sustained, demonstrated capacity for consistency and vulnerability that genuine reconciliation actually requires in order to succeed differently than the relationship did previously. This means the appropriate response to receiving one of these tests isn't excitement, and it isn't dismissal either. It's patient, careful observation, treating the test as the very first, smallest possible data point in what would need to become a considerably longer, more substantive pattern before any real trust or reinvestment becomes reasonable to extend. This patient observation protects against the very real risk of mistaking initial curiosity for genuine, sustained readiness, a mistake that tends to produce painful, familiar disappointment when the deeper work required for genuine change turns out not to have actually occurred. There's something crucial worth naming here as well, regarding what happens if this testing pattern repeats multiple times over an extended period without ever progressing into anything more direct or more substantive. This particular pattern, repeated testing without escalation into genuine, direct engagement, deserves to be understood clearly as its own distinct signal, considerably different from either a single test or a test that does eventually escalate into something more substantive. Repeated, non-escalating testing suggests an avoidant who remains genuinely curious or genuinely unresolved regarding the relationship's ending, but who either lacks the capacity or lacks the genuine motivation to move beyond this specific, low-risk pattern into anything requiring more direct, exposed vulnerability. This particular pattern deserves honest, clear-eyed assessment rather than continued hope that eventual escalation is simply a matter of enough patience or enough additional time. Some avoidants genuinely remain permanently, indefinitely stuck at this specific level of engagement, testing periodically without ever risking anything more substantial, precisely because the low-risk, deniable nature of testing itself becomes its own comfortable, if limited, way of maintaining some connection to the past relationship without ever requiring the more significant vulnerability that genuine reconciliation would actually demand. Recognizing this possibility honestly protects against remaining indefinitely available to a pattern that may never actually develop into anything more substantial than what it already is. There's a deeper psychological grounding worth explaining here as well, because it helps clarify why testing specifically, rather than direct, honest reaching out, becomes the default strategy once genuine risk has entered the picture. Human decision-making generally involves a well-documented asymmetry in how potential losses and potential gains get weighed against each other, where the pain of a potential loss tends to be felt considerably more intensely than the pleasure of an equivalent potential gain. This asymmetry shapes behavior considerably whenever genuine uncertainty exists regarding an outcome, producing a strong, largely automatic preference for approaches that minimize the risk of a clear, undeniable loss, even at the cost of also minimizing the potential for a clear, complete gain. For an avoidant facing genuine uncertainty about whether renewed contact will be welcomed or rejected, this asymmetry favors exactly the kind of small, deniable testing being described throughout this exploration over any more direct, higher stakes approach. A direct approach risks a clear, undeniable rejection, a considerably more painful outcome, according to this asymmetry, than the milder disappointment of receiving no response to something small and deniable enough to never have really counted as a genuine attempt in the first place. This isn't a conscious, deliberate calculation in most cases. It reflects a largely automatic, psychologically universal tendency to minimize the risk of clear, painful loss, applied here to the specific circumstance of testing whether a relationship's door remains open at all. This grounding matters because it explains why testing tends to persist as the default approach, even when a more direct, honest conversation would likely produce clearer, more useful information for everyone involved. The psychological pull toward minimizing potential loss, rather than maximizing potential clarity, operates powerfully enough that it frequently overrides what might otherwise seem like the more sensible, more mature approach of simply asking directly what someone actually wants. Understanding this doesn't excuse the confusion and frustration this pattern often produces for the person receiving it, but it does offer a more complete, more accurate picture of the psychological forces actually driving this particular kind of ambiguous indirect behavior. There's something worth naming that adds an important layer of understanding to everything explored so far, involving a genuine reversal of the power dynamic that likely characterized much of the relationship's earlier history. Throughout most avoidant relationships, as explored extensively elsewhere, the avoidant typically holds a considerable amount of relational power, precisely because their partner's greater investment and greater fear of loss creates an asymmetry where the avoidant can create distance without much risk, while their partner bears most of the anxiety regarding the relationship's continuation. By the time genuine, sustained no contact has occurred and this small testing behavior begins to appear, this dynamic has often reversed considerably, sometimes completely. The avoidant, for perhaps the first time in the relationship's entire history, now occupies the position of greater vulnerability, uncertain of their welcome, unsure whether reaching out carries risk of rejection, forced to test cautiously rather than assume access freely. This reversal deserves real attention because it explains why these tests carry such a fundamentally different emotional texture than anything the avoidant offered throughout the relationship's active period. Tentative, careful, deniable, precisely the kind of behavior that reflects genuine uncertainty about one's own welcome, rather than the confident, if inconsistent, presence that characterized their behavior when that welcome could still be taken for granted.